All right, welcome to our video about outcomes and legacies of our case studies. So, some quick definitions to start out with. First of all, an outcome is the way that something turns out. What's the immediate end of it, right? So, in our case, did things change right away, right? And if so, how did they change? So those are outcomes. They're the short term, what happens right now, right? As soon as something's over. Legacy, on the other hand, is longer lasting. And that's the long lasting impact of an event, a person, or an advocacy campaign, right? In our case, what we're looking at are things better or worse now than before. Did any of the changes that happened stay in place and make things better? Or did things get worse after the changes, or maybe not change at all? Okay? Sometimes when we're talking about legacies, there is no change and there is no lasting legacy. And it's okay to say that if you can't figure out what the change is or what the legacy is, right? That it didn't change and there was no lasting legacy. So we did one case study partially together. And so we're going to talk about that one. And a little bit about what some of the outcomes might be. And then I'm going to give you directions for what to do with the graphic organizers that go with this assignment, and also talk a little bit about where you can find some more information and things like that, right? And talk about the timeline assignment a touch. So, quick review of the McCleary decision. The state constitution says that it's the paramount duty of the state of Washington to provide an adequate education to all kids in the state. Okay? I'm paraphrasing there, it's not word for word. Those words, paramount duty, are direct from the Constitution. The part about adequate education, it might be good education. I forget exactly how they phrased it, but you get the idea. Okay? It's the paramount duty of the state of Washington to provide you with an education. So knowing that, some parents and stakeholders about 12, 13 years ago now got together and they sued the state of Washington because they felt that schools were inadequately funded in most areas of the state. And in those areas where they were properly funded, it wasn't because the state was doing it, but instead because local property taxes had been raised in order to be able to adequately fund education. Right? And that was happening in wealthier districts where everything is adequately funded, but even the poorer districts had property taxes and were attempting to subsidize what the state was giving their school district in order to try and do their best to provide that adequate education, right? Or that good education. So they sue, and the state Supreme Court rules in favor of the plaintiffs, that is to say the parents and the stakeholders, right? And the state is forced to reevaluate its funding formula and make adjustments so that most of the money is coming from the state and only a limited amount can come out of local property taxes, which helps make things more equitable, but it also meant a substantial raise in the amount of money that some districts were getting. So like Federal Way, for example, got a substantial raise. So again, just quick review, kind of the nutshell of some of the issues. So we end up with that issue of, again, not enough money. Okay? State of Washington isn't giving enough money to schools for a good education. Right? They're not providing for the basic needs of schools. So they're not giving money for teachers, for books, for good classrooms. So for example, after this decision I got, I think it was like a $10,000 a year pay raise or $15,000 a year pay raise. It was huge how much of a raise I got, right? I remember before McCleary teaching with books that literally were from the 90s that I had to beg for to be able to use to teach world history classes, right? It was crazy. It was crazy, okay? So under these new rules, again, the government has to change that formula for how it's giving schools and school districts money. And as a result, they're able to distribute more money to some of the poorer districts, and able to provide for that more equitable education to ensure all students are getting a good education, right? So there's better funding for things like teacher pay, which is important because that's one of the ways that you convince people to consider entering the field, right? They need to be able to support a family and live their lives without having to work 2 or 3 jobs. Okay? But also smaller class sizes when you're in building. Right? I've taught 45 kids. It's a bear, even when you're good at managing that many kids. It's a bear. Right? Much nicer when class sizes are more like 25. The courts kept an eye on the progress as they were doing this. So they checked to see. The state had to report back what it was going to do and how it was going to handle this. And when it didn't do it properly, the court actually levied fines on the state to make sure that it had an incentive to actually get this sorted out and get the districts the more money. Okay? And one of the big impacts across time is that it really has spurred a discussion about what it means for schools to be funded in a fair way, right? And that discussion is ongoing today. So there's still discussions, for example, about federal way teachers and how much we make compared to the districts around us based on how they calculate that formula for teacher salaries. Okay. So for this project, we're actually going to do 2 parts. And so I'm gonna go here and then I'll jump back to that timeline. But the first part that you're going to do when you're working on your own is a outcomes graphic organizer. So for this, you're going to use visual timeline, and you're going to use the one behind this slide. So I'll go back to that in a minute and review it. Okay. Talk about the outcomes of the decision. And again, the outcomes are the short terms, right? What's happening immediately after the decision, okay, within the first few years. And then you're also going to need to look at and talk about the legacies of the McCleary decision. And that means what's the long term? So we're about 10 years out now from when all this was happening, right? Enough to gain some of a view. So what are the long-term impacts of McCleary on schools? Okay. So to do this, you're going to look at, amongst other things, this visual timeline. Okay? And there is a link to this timeline, by the way, on the assignment so that you can just pull it up and look at it straight away. But you're also going to be creating your own, which is why I want to take a minute and go through this, right? So you've got a quote and a citation of the constitutional right in question. So in this case, right, it's a timeline of events for McCleary versus the state of Washington. There we go. There's the constitutional language. It is the paramount duty of the state to make ample provision for the education of all children residing within its borders. Okay. And tell you where to find that. Washington State Constitution, Article 9, Section 1. Okay. And then there's a quick summary of what happened. Okay. Then the visual part, you've got the picture of the Supreme Court, right, and of somebody arguing in front of the Supreme Court. And then you've got that timeline down below. And a timeline, remember, is a chronological list of events put in order. So I shouldn't have to say that put in order part, but you'd be surprised how many kids don't realize that chronological means that it's in order by time. So you do have to organize it by time. So you'll see this one covers 2013, 2014, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, right? And as you're looking at it, you can see, so the Supreme Court, here's the decision, or here's the case in 2011, right? And then in 2012, they issue their decision and they retain, that means they keep jurisdiction over the case to facilitate progress. Jurisdiction means that they keep control. We're going to keep control of the case to make sure that progress is happening. So that happens in January. In July, they order a report at the conclusion of each legislative session from 2013 to 2018. So now they're saying we got to have regular check-ins, right? December 2012, the state Supreme Court holds that the first report falls short. So they're not doing enough to show progress. They've got to do more. Okay? Skip ahead a little bit to January 2014, and the Supreme Court orders a complete plan for fully implementing the legislature's program for basic education by April. So now they're saying, okay, you're not doing this. We're going to give you some hard deadlines to do it, right? Then, so they turn that in. Then by September, the Supreme Court says, you're in contempt. It means you're not doing what you need to do. Okay? When somebody is found in contempt, it means they're not doing what they need to do according to the court. Okay? So they're complying with that they're not complying with that January order. But the court says, we're going to give you a second chance. We're going to delay the sanctions. That's the punishment for the 2015 legislative session. Right? Oh, I forgot. In June, they did a show cause hearing. So in other words, why should you not have to comply with what we've asked you to do? Okay. So the state didn't come up with the plan in April. In June, the Supreme Court says, explain to us why we shouldn't sanction you for this. And then they ultimately do sanction them, right? But they say, okay, we're going to give you one more chance. 2015 rolls around, April. There's an extension because there's a special session, so they're working on it. They're not there, but they're working on it, right? That's what a special session means, is that the legislature is continuing to work. June, they provide another extension. And by August, they're ordering sanctions. Again, they're ordering punishments. In this case, it was fines on the state legislature for every day they were out of compliance. If I remember right, I think they put them into a savings account that then went towards paying down what was owed to schools in order to bring them into compliance. Okay, so you'll be able to see this timeline as one of the linked documents in the assignment. All right, so we talked about outcomes versus legacies. You're going to do this for the case study you've been working on, whichever one you chose, whichever one of the four. There are documents linked in the assignment for that. And then you're also going to create your own visual timeline. You're also going to create your own visual timeline. So you can, this handout is provided to you, right? It'll be a way to organize your information, and then you're going to create some kind of maybe a poster or maybe some Google slides or some PowerPoint slides to work as a timeline. It counts as a timeline as long as the events are in order by time. So you have to give us dates. Okay. You're not going to do 6 to 8 events. You're going to do 3 to 4 events, because if you were in person, there would be 2 people working on this. Since there's only one of you, you get to do half as many. So 3 to 4 events. And then for each of those events, there's a title, a date, and some kind of an in-text citation for each event. Okay, some kind of an in-text citation. And then you do need to provide interactive elements, an image, a link, something like that, that is going to provide you with the interactivity piece of it. Okay. All right, so some things to know about sources. First of all, Google is not a source. Do not cite Google as a source. It is a search engine. Would be like saying that the table of contents is a source for information, or the index in a book. Don't do it. Okay. To find the actual source, click on the image or the link provided to go to the source. Okay. If it's an image, that sidebar doesn't count. You need to click through until you get to the actual page that the picture is embedded on. Okay. So again, Google's not a source. Don't cite it as a source. I will not count it as a source. Different types of sources. So we're going to be dealing with primary sources, secondary sources, and you might be looking at some government documents. Okay. So primary sources, when you're doing your timeline, these are ones that are created at or near the event in time by people who were involved or present when something happened. Okay. So if I go to the theater, and let's just say over Thanksgiving, for example, I went and saw Wicked in the theater at the Paramount, and being in the audience, if I go home and write a journal entry about that, about seeing Wicked at the Paramount in person, that's a primary source, right? Because I saw it, I went home, I wrote it right away. That's a primary source. Okay. People have to be involved or present when something happened. So when we're talking about the McCleary decision, the actual court decision or the materials provided to the court as part of its decision-making process count as primary sources. Okay. Non-example. What would not work is a newspaper article written in 2023 about the legacies and outcomes of the McCleary decision. That's not a primary source, even though it might rely on primary sources. Okay. Secondary sources. These are created at a later date and are based on a combination of primary sources and potentially other secondary sources. Okay. Typically, they include some interpretation of the sources and claim, and some kind of a claim by the author with regards to the topic. Okay. So that non-example of a primary source, that would be a secondary source. Okay. If I go see Wicked over Thanksgiving and I write about it 6 months from now in June, right? That's a secondary source at that point because it's not close in time. I'm getting farther and farther away. Government documents. These are produced by a government for a specific purpose. Okay. Most typically, these are secondary sources. They're reports that governments are writing about things. But they can also be primary sources, right? It just kind of depends on what exactly you're looking at. You'll need to make a judgment call about whether it's primary or secondary. Okay? In general, these are considered to be highly credible sources. Note the in general, because that means not every source is going to be credible, which is true of any research you ever do. Okay? It's true of any research you ever do. Not all sources are created equal, and you'll need to make some judgment calls about what works and what doesn't. What's a good source and what's a bad source. All right, almost done. Really quick, citations. You do need to include citations as part of this work. And this is one of those times where I hereby officially give you permission to use an online tool and not credit it, and to copy and paste from it. Matter of fact, I strongly encourage you to do just that because citations are persnickety and annoying to do by hand. There's lots of little periods and commas and abbreviations and blah, blah, blah. It's annoying. I used to have to do them by hand, goofed them up almost every single time, right? So use an online tool, something like Citation Machine. Okay? There's a bunch of them out there. Citation Machine is just one I commonly use when I have to do citations. Any of them should work. Go ahead, tell it to use an MLA format. MLA stands for Modern Language Association, but you just need to know MLA. Okay? And let me know if you need some help getting started and getting it sorted once you have a tool in mind. Okay? They're usually pretty straightforward to use. Honestly, they're not very hard to use. Then once it gives you the citation, you're going to copy and paste the in-text citation, not the footnote, not the bibliographic citation, the in-text citation. This will be short, probably have parentheses around it. Okay? Might have 1 or 2 elements to it. Like if it were a book and it's an in-text citation, it's usually the author's name and the page number. is what the citation would be. That's what I mean for short. Okay. But again, use an online tool to help you do them. Use MLA as your format because that's a standard history format. All right, we're going to end here, but I'm going to encourage you to take a little bit of time and keep thinking about this question, right? Do some reflecting. Think about this question. Why do people advocate for issues in their communities? And I will see you in class. Let me know if you have questions or need help with any of this.